B.2.5 Who benefits from centralization? No social system would exist unless it benefited someone or some group. Centralization, be it in the state or the company, is no different. In all cases, centralization directly benefits those at the top because it shelters them from those who are below, allowing the latter to be controlled and governed more effectively. Therefore, it is in the direct interests of bureaucrats and politicians to support centralism. Under capitalism, however, various sections of the business class also support state centralism. This is the symbiotic relationship between capital and the state. As will be discussed later in section F.8, the state played an important role in nationalizing the market, i.e., forcing the free market onto society. By centralizing power in the hands of representatives and so creating a state bureaucracy, ordinary people were disempowered and thus became less likely to interfere with the interests of the wealthy. Open quote. In a republic, writes Bakunin, the so-called people, the legal people, allegedly represented by the state, stifle and will keep on stifling the actual and living people by the bureaucratic world for the greater benefit of the privileged propertied classes as well as for its own benefit. End quote. Examples of increased political centralization being promoted by wealthy business interests can be seen throughout the history of capitalism. Open quote. In revolutionary America, the nature of city government came in for heated discussion, observed Merrill Jensen. Town meetings had been a focal point of revolutionary activity. The anti-democratic reaction that set in after the American Revolution was marked by efforts to do away with town meeting government. Attempts by conservative elements were made to establish a corporate form of municipal government whereby the towns would be governed by mayors and councils elected from urban wards. The merchants backed incorporation consistently in their effort to escape town meetings. End quote. Here we see local policy-making being taken out of the hands of the many and centralized in the hands of the few, who are always the wealthy. France provides another example. Open quote. The government found the folk motes of all households too noisy, too disobedient, and in 1787, elected councils composed of a mayor and 3 to 6 syndics, chosen among the wealthier peasants, were introduced instead. End quote. This was part of a general movement to disempower the working class by centralizing decision-making power into the hands of the few, as in the American Revolution. Kropotkin indicates the process at work. Open quote. The middle classes who had, until then, sought the support of the people in order to obtain constitutional laws and to dominate the higher nobility were going, now that they had seen and felt the strength of the people, to do all they could to dominate the people, to disarm them, and to drive them back into subjection. They made haste to legislate in such a way that the political power which was slipping out of the hand of the court should not fall into the hands of the people. Thus, it was proposed to divide the French into 2 classes, of which one only, the active citizens, should take part in the government, whilst the other, comprising the great mass of the people under the name of passive citizens, should be deprived of all political rights. The National Assembly divided France into departments, always maintaining the principle of excluding the poorer classes from the government. They excluded from the primary assemblies the mass of the people, who could no longer take part in the primary assemblies, and accordingly had no right to nominate the electors, who chose representatives to the National Assembly, or the municipality, or any of the local authorities. And finally, the permanence of the electoral assemblies was interdicted. Once the middle-class governors were appointed, these assemblies were not to meet again. Once the middle-class governors were appointed, they must not be controlled too strictly. Soon, the right even of petitioning and of passing resolutions was taken away. Vote and hold your tongue. As to the villages, the General Assembly of the inhabitants, to which belonged the administration of the affairs of the commune, were forbidden by the law. Henceforth, only the well-to-do peasants The active citizens had the right to meet once a year to nominate the mayor and the municipality, composed of 3 or 4 middle-class men of the village. A similar municipal organization was given to the towns. Thus, the middle classes surrounded themselves with every precaution in order to keep the municipal power in the hands of the well-to-do members of the community." End quote. Thus, centralization aimed to take power away from the mass of the people and give it to the wealthy. The power of the people rested in popular assemblies, such as the sections and districts of Paris, expressing, in Kropotkin's words, open quote, "the principles of anarchism and practicing direct self-government," end quote, and village assemblies. However, the National Assembly, open quote, tried all it could to lessen the power of the districts and put an end to those hotbeds of revolution by allowing active citizens only to take part in the electoral and administrative assemblies, end quote. Thus, the, open quote, central government was steadily endeavoring to subject the sections to its authority, with the state seeking to centralize everything in its own hands. It's depriving the popular organizations of all administrative functions, and it's subjecting them to its bureaucracy in police matters, meant the death of the sections, end quote. As can be seen, both the French and American revolutions saw a similar process by which the wealthy centralized power into their own hands. Volume 1 of Murray Bookchin's The Third Revolution discusses the French and American revolutions in some detail. This ensured that working-class people, i.e. the majority, were excluded from the decision-making process and subject to the laws and power of a few, which, of course, benefits the minority class whose representatives have that power. This was the rationale for the centralization of power in every revolution. Whether it was the American, French, or Russian, the centralization of power was the means to exclude the many from participating in the decisions that affected them and their communities. For example, the founding fathers of the American state were quite explicitly on the need for centralization for precisely this reason. For James Madison, the key worry was when the majority gained control of popular government and was in a position to, open quote, sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens, end quote. Thus, the public good escaped the majority, nor was it, as you would think, what the public thought of as good. For some reason left unexplained, Madison considered the majority able to pick those who could identify the public good. To safeguard against this, he advocated a republic rather than a democracy in which the citizens, open quote, assemble and administer the government in person, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, end quote. He, of course, took it for granted that, open quote, those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society, end quote. His schema was to ensure that private property was defended and, as a consequence, the interests of those who held it protected. Hence, the need for, open quote, the delegation of the government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest, end quote. This centralization of power into a few hands locally was matched by a territorial centralization for the same reason. Madison favored, open quote, a large over a small republic, as a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, end quote. This desire to have a formal democracy where the masses are mere spectators of events rather than participants is a recurring theme in capitalism. See the chapter Force and Opinion in Noam Chomsky Deterring Democracy for a good overview. On the federal and state levels in the US after the Revolution, centralization of power was encouraged since, open quote, most of the makers of the Constitution had some direct economic interest in establishing a strong federal government, end quote. Needless to say, while the rich elite were well represented in formulating the principles of the new order, 4 groups were not: slaves, indentured servants, women, men without property. Needless to say, the new state and its constitution did not reflect their interests. Given that these were the vast majority, open quote, there was not only a positive need for strong central government to protect the large economic interests, but also immediate fear of rebellion by discontented farmers, end quote. The chief event was Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts. There, the new constitution had raised property qualifications for voting, and, therefore, no one could hold state office without being wealthy. The new state was formed to combat such rebellions, to protect the wealthy few against the many. Moreover, state centralization, the exclusion of popular participation, was essential to mold U.S. society into one dominated by capitalism. Open quote. In the 30 years leading up to the Civil War, the law was increasingly interpreted in the courts to suit capitalist development. Studying this, Morton Horowitz, The Transformation of American Law, points out that the English common law was no longer holy when it stood in the way of business growth. Judgments for damages against businessmen were taken out of the hands of juries, which were unpredictable, and given to judges. The ancient idea of a fair price for goods gave way in the courts to the idea of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Contract law was intended to discriminate against working people and for business. The pretense of the law was that a worker and a railroad made a contract with equal bargaining power. The circle was completed. The law had come simply to ratify those forms of inequality that the market system had produced. End quote. The U.S. state was created on elitist liberal doctrine and actively aimed to reduce democratic tendencies in the name of individual liberty. What happened in practice, unsurprisingly enough, was that the wealthy elite used the state to undermine popular culture and common right in favor of protecting and extending their own interests and power. In the process, U.S. society was reformed in their own image. By the middle of the 19th century, the legal system had been reshaped to the advantage of men of commerce and industry at the expense of farmers, workers, consumers, and other less powerful groups in society. It actively promoted a legal distribution of wealth against the weakest groups in society. End quote. In more modern times, state centralization and expansion has gone hand in glove with rapid industrialization and the growth of business. As Edward Herman points out, open quote, to a great extent, it was the growth in business size and power that elicited the countervailing emergence of unions and the growth of government. Bigness beyond business was, to a large extent, a response to bigness in business. End quote. State centralization was required to produce bigger, well-defined markets and was supported by business when it acted in their interests, i.e., as markets expanded, so did the state in order to standardize and enforce property laws, and so on. On the other hand, this development towards big government created an environment in which big business could grow, often encouraged by the state by subsidies and protectionism, as would be expected when the state is run by the wealthy, as well as further removing state power from influence by the masses and placing it more firmly in the hands of the wealthy. It is little wonder we see such developments for, open quote, structures of governance tend to coalesce around domestic power, in the last few centuries, economic power, end quote. State centralization makes it easier for business to control government, ensuring that it remains their puppet and to influence the political process. For example, the European Roundtable, ERT, open quote, an elite lobby group of chairmen or chief executives of large multinationals based mainly in the EU, with 11 of the 20 largest European companies with combined sales in 1991 exceeding 500 billion, approximately 60% of EU industrial production, end quote, makes much use of the EU. As two researchers who have studied this body note, the ERT, open quote, is adept at lobbying, so that many ERT proposals and visions are mysteriously regurgitated in Commission Summit documents. The ERT claims that the labor market should be more flexible, arguing the more flexible hours, seasonal contracts, job sharing, and part-time work. In December 1993, 7 years after the ERT made its suggestions, And after most states had agreed to the Maastricht Treaty and its social chapter, the European Commission published a white paper proposing making labor markets in Europe more flexible. End quote. The current talk of globalization, NAFTA, and the single European market indicates an underlying transformation in which state growth follows the path cut by economic growth. Simply put, with the growth of transnational corporations and global finance markets, the bounds of the nation-state have been made economically redundant. As companies have expanded into multinationals, so the pressure has mounted for states to follow suit and rationalize their markets across nations by creating multi-state agreements and unions. As Noam Chomsky notes, G7, the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth are a, open quote, de facto world government, and the institutions of the transnational state largely serve other masters than the people, as state power typically does. In this case, the rising transnational corporations in the domains of finance and other services, manufacturing, media, and communications, end quote. As multinationals grow and develop, breaking through national boundaries, a corresponding growth in statism is required. Moreover, a, open quote, particularly valuable feature of the rising de facto governing institutions is their immunity from popular influence, even awareness. They operate in secret, creating a world subordinated to the needs of investors, with the public put in its place, the threat of democracy reduced. End quote. This does not mean that capitalists desire state centralization for everything. Often, particularly for social issues, relative decentralization is often preferred, i.e., power is given to local bureaucrats in order to increase business control over them. By devolving control to local areas, the power which large corporations, investment firms, and the like have over the local government increases proportionally. In addition, even middle-sized enterprise can join in and influence, constrain, or directly control local policies and set one workforce against another. Private power can ensure that freedom is safe, their freedom. No matter which set of bureaucrats are selected, the need to centralize social power, thus marginalizing the population, is of prime importance to the business class. It is also important to remember that capitalist opposition to big government is often financial, as the state feeds off the available social surplus, so reducing the amount left for the market to distribute to the various capitals in competition. In reality, what capitalists object to about big government is its spending on social programs designed to benefit the poor and working class, an illegitimate function which wastes part of the surplus that might go to capital, and also makes people less desperate and so less willing to work cheaply. Hence the constant push to reduce the state to its classical role as protector of private property and the system, and little else. Other than their specious quarrel with the welfare state, capitalists are the staunchest supporters of government and the correct form of state intervention, such as defense spending, as evidenced by the fact that funds can always be found to build more prisons and send troops abroad to advance ruling class interests, even as politicians are crying that there is no money in the treasury for scholarships, national health care, or welfare for the poor. State centralization ensures that, open quote, as much as the equalitarian principles have been embodied in its political constitutions, it is the bourgeoisie that governs, and it is the people, the workers, peasants included, who obey the laws made by the bourgeoisie, who has, in fact, if not by right, the exclusive privilege of governing. This means that political equality is only a puerile fiction, an utter lie. It takes a great deal of faith to assume that the rich, being so far removed from the people by the conditions of its economic and social existence, can give expression in the government and in the laws to the feelings, the ideas, and the will of the people. Unsurprisingly, we find that in legislation, as well as in carrying on the government, the bourgeoisie is guided by its own interests and its own instincts without concerning itself much with the interests of the people. So while on election days, even the proudest bourgeois who have any political ambitions are forced to court the sovereign people. But on the day after the elections, everyone goes back to their daily business, and the politicians are given carte blanche to rule in the name of the people, they claim to represent." End quote.